Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here by trial attorney Janine Atamian. We have a lot of trials to break down for you today. We're going to be live in multiple courtrooms across the country. And I know I say this a lot, but I have to say it again. We have a lot to cover, so let's break it all down. Now, first up, we're going to be back in verdict watch in the McStay family murder trial. It's kind of unbelievable to think we're finally coming to the conclusion of a trial that began with opening statements all the way back in January. The jury so far has deliberated around 10 hours, and they're not going to start up again until later on in this afternoon. The jury has a big decision on their hands. They'll have to decide whether or not Charles Merritt murdered his former business associate Joseph McStay, along with his wife Summer and their two sons Gianni and Joseph Jr. His attorneys have argued that the prosecution hasn't made their case and that there was an alternative suspect that was overlooked. We're going to bring you more information on this case once it starts back up today, and you're not going to want to miss it. Next, we are also coming to the end of the trial of a former NFL star who's accused of being a sexual predator of women. Of course, talking about the case of Kellen Winslow II. The defendant has been charged with multiple felonies involving 5 women. The charges range from indecent exposure to rape and kidnapping. If convicted, Winslow could face the rest of his life in prison. Both sides have officially rested. Winslow himself did not take the stand, and we are going to bring you the closing arguments today when they start up at around 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, we're going to be live today in day 2 of the capital murder trial of Brenda Delgado out of Texas, whom the prosecution says was a jilted ex-girlfriend that plotted the killing of her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend, Dr. Kendra Hatcher, a pediatric dentist. Delgado is accused of hiring an assassin, Christopher Love, to shoot Dr. Hatcher in a parking garage. We learned all about the disturbing and sordid details of this love triangle gone wrong when we covered the trial of Love. A jury found him guilty of the murder of Hatcher and sentenced him to death. Yesterday was quite the day in court. We saw explosive opening statements, particularly from the defense, and emotional testimony, including from the victim's mother. We're going to be back live in that courtroom today at around 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Finally, the jury will continue deliberating in the Timothy Jones trial out of South Carolina. Jones is charged with brutally killing his 5 children ages 1 through 8. And as if that wasn't horrific enough, he then allegedly put their bodies in plastic bags, tossed them in his car, and drove around the Southeast, going from state to state for days until finally burying them in rural Alabama. Jones's attorneys have been arguing the insanity defense. Here are the possible verdicts that the jury could come up with. They could come forward with, obviously, guilty. They could come forward with guilty but mentally ill, which means that the defendant would most likely go to prison but receive medical treatment. They could find him not guilty by reason of insanity, meaning he probably will be committed to a mental health facility instead of prison, or they could find him just straight up not guilty. Now, first, we want to start off with the closing arguments from yesterday in case you haven't had an opportunity to see them. Here's the prosecution. Now, Janine, this is a horrible case, but there's a lot for the jury to consider here. I mean, they have those 4 options they could go forward with. What do you think they're deliberating? What do you think that they're wrestling with right now?
Well, I think that although they've got the 4 options, the defense did not put on a proper defense with regard to the psychiatrist that they called, because he admits that he got paid $25,000. He admits that he saw him for 3 hours. So to me, I don't think that they've met that burden. Well,
they had another expert who came on that said, you know, I looked at him and in my opinion, he does meet the criteria of insanity. They called this final expert who studied him and said, you know, he couldn't tell the difference between right and wrong. They called another expert who said that he suffered from schizophrenia, and they called another expert to talk about, you know, MRIs of his brain and how there's a depressed skull fracture. But you're right, they did hurt themselves by calling that one witness.
I agree.
So how do they balance it? I mean, what are they asking the jury to do here?
Well, I think, again, it's a really heinous crime. It's an evil crime. The jury kind of wants to believe that he's insane because, you know, who does this to 5 little babies? But I think that the prosecution's closing argument is really strong. He makes a very, very strong and good argument that this is a monster. It's not an insane person, it's a monster.
Yeah, and I want to play more of the prosecution. You know, the defense had a metaphor that they were using during their openings, talking about a forest. Well, the prosecutor had a response to that. Let's take a look. Janine, you made a good point. Like, one of the things the defense said was killing children that one loves is insane. And you want people, you almost want someone to be insane, because who in their right mind would kill their children? And the question really is insanity. Now, I want to put up the graphic here, if we can, of what insanity law is in South Carolina. And it's very different, isn't it, Janine? Because usually when we have insanity, the jury has two options here. Well, first they have to determine if he has a mental disease or defect. And let's say they find that. Then usually under insanity defense, they have two ways to find it. Either he didn't know the difference between right and wrong, or if he did know the difference, he couldn't conform his behavior to the law. Here, they split it up. The only way you can be found not guilty by reason of insanity is if the defendant didn't know the difference between right and wrong. If they feel that he did, then the question is he guilty but mentally ill? Why do you think South Carolina splits it up like that?
I think it's a higher threshold, and I think that it's important, especially in this case, because again, if he didn't know right from wrong, why did he lie to the wife when he was driving the kids in the car? Well,
couldn't you have a psychotic episode and then afterwards you can still cover up the crime and still that be insanity?
It's possible. It's absolutely possible.
Is that what they're arguing here?
I think that's the only argument that they have, because again, when he's going from state to state, it almost looks like he's fleeing. He's doing Google searches or searches on his phone for various ways to kind of get away with it. He lies to the wife, various things that he does. I think that's the only argument that they have.
And the idea here, you know, his police interview or his interview with the FBI, where they ask him questions that are basically taken from the insanity definition. Were you thinking about the law? Because I wasn't thinking about the law. He knew that he was hurting his children. But what the defense has been trying to say is, here's a guy who thought maybe killing his children was the better option, that, you know, them in heaven, as opposed to living out their lives. He thought that he was doing the right thing, and he couldn't tell the difference between moral right and wrong. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they talk a lot about his different religious beliefs, the talking in tongue, the different pastors that he followed and what they said. But the other thing that's important is when he leads them to the bodies of the children, he stops talking about these voices in his head that told him to kill the children, and instead he's saying, I made a mistake, I made bad decisions. It changes. So I think that that's an important part to focus on as well.
You also have 5 victims. Wouldn't it have been a lot different if, for instance, there was one act that killed all 5 children at the same time? And you'd say, well, somebody was insane at that very moment, as opposed to being insane for a period of time where it's a deliberate killing, after a deliberate killing, after a deliberate killing. You know, it's a conscious act each time you kill somebody.
The other thing is he kills the children in kind of an order. You know, Natan goes first because he's the one that he's having the issue with, and then he goes to the son, and then the daughter, and then the 2 littlest ones. So there's kind of an order to it as well.
As sick as that is to say, you're right, there is an order to this. I mean, what do you make of that? This idea that the theory put forward is that the defendant thought that his children were out to get him. There was a conspiracy with the kids to go after the father. What do you make of that?
I think that it's a convenient conspiracy for him to have at this point. I think that when we saw the trial as it began, he never showed emotion until he was hearing himself confess.
Right.
So I think that it's just convenient.
You're talking about when he actually does tear up. It's at that very moment when you hear him confessing, not to all the other details about what happened to these kids. Now, here's the thing. If he really thought that what he was doing was right, you know, by beating his children or disciplining his children, how does that change the analysis?
Well, here's the thing. So we know that there were babysitters that saw him do this kind of punishment. So I don't think that he didn't think he was right. And I think with the first child, it's possible that it went too far and it was an accident. But how do you explain killing the other 4?
Yeah, and that's a really tough job for this jury. I have to say, this seems like a tough case for them. Would you agree?
I think, especially you've got 10 women on that jury, watching this testimony about these 5 children, watching that mother collapse on the stand. It's hard for everybody.
But also trying to weave out which expert to believe and which one not to believe. I looked at every expert and thought they were all credible. What is a jury supposed to do?
I think, again, this is a highly emotional case, so you're going to have all of these different experts saying all these different things, but at the end of the day, that jury is going to kind of internalize and look and say, what do I think? Not necessarily what do they tell me, but what do I think?
Right, they all bring their own life experiences, their own judgment. That's why we have a jury. That's why we have a jury here. And let's play more of the prosecution's closing argument, their last attempt to try to tell this jury, don't believe what the defense is selling. Watch. And that's the prosecution describing how the defendant was cold-blooded and evil. That's what they need to do in order to get that successful verdict. But Janine, one of the other things that the jury has to consider is, was all of this caused by a substance or not? You know, the idea of, did drugs cause this or did they contribute to it, is a big decision for the jury, because the prosecution basically talked about Dr. Richard Frierson, who was one of the defense's own witness, and said he believes that the defendant had a substance-induced psychosis. But we all know you can't have insanity and blame it on drugs. So how's the jury going to sort this out?
So I think that legally, as we both know, that's not an option for them, but it was important to get it out there to kind of, again, explain how he got there. They talked about how the month before, I think it was about $70 he spent, but on this month he had spent $260. He was waking and baking, he used those words.
Right.
And so he was kind of intoxicated. Again, I think they're getting it out there just to kind of help explain, again, what's going on with him.
Do you think that the defense has at the very least established that he had a mental disorder, a mental defect, something going on?
Not for me.
Not for you?
Not for me.
So no traumatic brain injury, no schizophrenia, no bipolar disorder, nothing like that?
I understand that his mother was institutionalized. I understand that there's a history. I know that he had the head injury, but he also was a successful person for all these years. We had the therapist that wrote the letter that got him custody say that he was responsible and fit. I just think it's convenient at this point.
The more time it takes the jury to deliberate, does that mean more they're wrestling with this insanity issue? Is that worse for the state?
I think if I were the state, I would be thinking it was. I would be thinking I want a quick verdict. So the longer they're there, you know, because there were moments that obviously make you think he had to be.
Exactly, because who would ultimately do this? If it's successful, though, this would be the first time in South Carolina history that you would have a death penalty eligible defendant who would be successfully putting forward the insanity defense. This would be groundbreaking. But again, there's a reason it's so rare to have that insanity defense.
There's a first time for everything.
There is, and you know, we're still waiting. We have a lot to see what ultimately will happen here. But my question to you is, do you think the defense made a mistake strategically in their case that they might be saying if they don't get the kind of verdict that they wanted, perhaps they should have done something differently?
I think at this point they went the best route for them because he admitted it. He'd admitted it right from the beginning. This is the only thing I think they could have done. Yeah,
I think we've all been questioning here on the network why they called that psychiatrist who didn't help their case, why they called those babysitters and his ex-girlfriend who didn't really contribute much to the insanity defense, and you could argue maybe hurt the insanity defense. But we're not there yet. We're still waiting to see what the jury will ultimately come back with. When we come back, we're going to play you the defense's closing argument. We'll be back.